Today we're going to talk about real actionable tools for overcoming substance and behavioral addictions. We'll base this on what modern neuroscience, psychology, and clinical studies tell us, not just ideas, but protocols that can actually change the brain and behavior in lasting ways. First, let's be very clear about what addiction is. Addiction, whether it's to drugs, alcohol, gambling, pornography, social media, even certain foods, is not simply about pleasure. It's about a malfunction in the brain's reward circuitry, particularly involving the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine isn't just about pleasure, it's about motivation, drive, and pursuit. Addictive behaviors hijack this system, causing a loop where the pursuit itself becomes compulsive, detached from real satisfaction. Understanding this is key, because if we know the circuits, we can change the circuits. One of the most powerful and accessible tools for overcoming addiction is what we call intermittent disruption of the reward system. To understand why this is so effective, we first need to appreciate how the brain's reward pathways actually work. Most people think addiction is about liking something too much, but the science tells us it's more about the way our brain adapts to repeated high-intensity stimulation of dopamine circuits. When you engage in a substance or behavior that releases a lot of dopamine, whether that's drugs, alcohol, gambling, social media scrolling, or even excessive junk food, the brain initially responds with a strong signal of motivation and pleasure. But with repeated use, the baseline level of dopamine starts to drop. This means that not only do we get less pleasure from the addictive behavior itself over time, but we also start to experience less pleasure from everyday activities that would normally feel rewarding, like social interactions, physical exercise, or creative work. In neuroscience, we call this the dopamine deficit state. It's a major reason why addiction can feel so hopeless, because the brain literally becomes less responsive to natural sources of enjoyment. And yet, there's a very important aspect of this system. It's plastic. It can change. It can recover. But that recovery requires a period of recalibration. And recalibration requires intentional disruption of the cycle. Intermittent self-deprivation is not the same as total abstinence from day one. Although for some people, especially with certain substances, complete abstinence is necessary and life-saving. But in the broader context, especially when dealing with behavioral addictions or early-stage substance dependence, intermittent disruption provides a manageable, scientifically grounded strategy for regaining control. What this looks like in practice is setting up structured periods where you intentionally delay or skip engagement with the addictive behavior or substance. These periods are not random, they're planned, measurable, and progressive. For example, if someone is using a certain substance every single day, the first goal might be to go one full day without it. That might seem small. It might even seem pointless. But neurologically, it's not. Each successful gap in the cycle creates an opportunity for the brain to experience craving without immediate reinforcement. This is crucial because the craving itself, when tolerated, actually starts to weaken the compulsive connection. You begin to teach your brain that an urge can arise and pass without requiring immediate action. You start to weaken the wiring between the cue and the behavior. Over time, the periods of abstinence can be extended 2 days, 3 days, a week, and with each extension, the reward system has more opportunity to normalize. What's happening biologically during these abstinent windows is profound. There's an upregulation of dopamine receptors, meaning the brain becomes more sensitive to natural dopamine release. The baseline starts to rise. People begin to notice that small pleasures, a good conversation, a walk in nature, a creative project, start to feel enjoyable again. It doesn't happen overnight, but it happens predictably with consistency. It's important during these abstinent periods to be very objective about tracking progress. The brain responds to objective measurement. Keeping a journal, making a physical checklist, even using an app that tracks behavior change can significantly enhance the success of this tool. When we measure something, we bring it into conscious awareness. And conscious awareness is the first step toward rewiring unconscious patterns. Another key point here is that during the early phases of intermittent deprivation, cravings are inevitable. They should not be viewed as a sign of failure. In fact, experiencing craving without acting on it is one of the most potent forms of neuroplastic training available. Every time a craving is felt and not acted upon, the brain's executive control circuits, located mainly in the prefrontal cortex, are strengthened. It's like lifting a weight in the gym. The discomfort is the signal that adaptation is occurring. Some people find it useful to pair the abstinence windows with replacement behaviors, especially in the early phase. For example, during times when they would normally engage in the addictive behavior, they might do something physically intense like exercise, something cognitively engaging like learning a new skill, or something socially connective like calling a friend. These are not just distractions. They are activities that stimulate dopamine in a healthier, more sustainable pattern, helping to rewire the system even faster. It's also critical to structure the environment to support these periods of abstinence. That might mean removing physical cues associated with the addictive behavior, keeping substances out of the house, disabling apps, avoiding particular social settings. The brain is highly context dependent. If the environment constantly triggers the old patterns, it becomes exponentially harder to succeed. On the other hand, if you modify the environment so that access to the addictive behavior requires more effort, you tilt the odds in your favor. Finally, it's worth recognizing that early efforts often feel hard, not because you're failing, but because you're winning. The discomfort, the agitation, even the boredom that arises during abstinence periods are signs that the brain is adjusting, that the system is learning how to function again without constant artificial stimulation. The prefrontal cortex is one of the most powerful allies we have when it comes to overcoming addiction, but it's also one of the first areas of the brain that gets compromised in the cycle of compulsive behavior. The prefrontal cortex, located right behind the forehead, governs what neuroscientists call executive functions: planning, impulse control, decision-making, evaluating future consequences of actions. It's the part of the brain that allows you to think beyond immediate gratification and toward long-term goals. When addiction takes hold, this area shows decreased activity. People find it harder to delay gratification, harder to resist urges, and harder to remember why they wanted to quit in the first place. But like any neural system, the prefrontal cortex can be trained and strengthened. One of the most effective ways to build up the prefrontal cortex is to deliberately place the brain and body into mild states of stress and teach them how to tolerate discomfort without immediately escaping it. In addiction, a major pattern is the immediate escape from any form of discomfort, physical, emotional, psychological. Over time, this trains the brain to have a very low threshold for any form of internal agitation. By using small, deliberate interventions that create manageable levels of stress, we can train the system to become more resilient, and when resilience goes up, impulse control goes up. Cold exposure is one of the simplest and most powerful tools for this. When you step into a cold shower, immerse in cold water, or even expose your hands and face to cold air, the body immediately reacts. Heart rate increases, breathing quickens. The mind starts to scream for relief. Every fiber of your nervous system urges you to get out of the cold. But if you stay, even for a minute or two, focusing on slow, deliberate breathing, you send a signal back up to your prefrontal cortex that discomfort is not an emergency. You teach your system that you can stay calm even when the environment is screaming otherwise. You build what is called top-down control, the ability of the thinking brain to regulate the emotional, reactive brain. The specific protocol is simple. Engage in 1 to 3 minutes of deliberate cold exposure each day. It can be as straightforward as a cold shower, aiming to endure the cold without excessive shivering, maintaining calm breathing. Ideally, you enter the cold environment not slowly but directly, exposing yourself to that sharp moment of shock and learning to control the response. Over days and weeks, not only does the physical stress response become more manageable, but individuals report significantly higher levels of emotional regulation across many domains of life. Another tool for training the prefrontal cortex is breath work, specifically controlled respiration patterns that mimic stress states followed by deliberate calming. One protocol involves cyclic hyperventilation, rapid deep breathing for about 20 to 30 breaths, followed by a prolonged exhale and breath hold. This creates a spike in adrenaline and physiological arousal, followed by a deep conscious control of the calming system. What you're doing in this practice is almost identical to what you experience during cravings or stress in real life. A sudden escalation of physiological tension, but instead of reacting automatically, you guide yourself back into calm using your conscious control systems. Practicing controlled stress responses daily makes it far easier to manage the intense waves of craving or anxiety that often trigger relapse. When a strong craving hits, the body feels almost hijacked, flooded with urgency. If you have trained your nervous system to experience internal storms without immediate reaction, you have a tool you can deploy in real time. Breathing calmly, staying present, choosing your next move deliberately rather than compulsively. It's also important to understand that these practices not only strengthen the circuits for impulse control, they physically remodel the brain. Studies using MRI imaging have shown that individuals who engage in regular cold exposure or structured breath work show increased thickness and activity in the prefrontal regions, responsible for self-control and emotional regulation. Neural pathways that fire together wire together. Each time you resist the urge to escape minor stress, you strengthen the pathways needed to resist major temptations later. Moreover, these practices enhance neurochemical resilience. Regular exposure to brief controlled stress increases baseline levels of norepinephrine, a neurochemical involved in focus, alertness, and mood. Low baseline norepinephrine is often associated with depression and low motivation, both of which are risk factors for relapse. By naturally boosting these systems, you not only enhance your ability to control impulses, but you also feel more energized and capable throughout the day, reducing the need to turn to substances or behaviors for a boost. Training the prefrontal cortex is not a quick fix. It requires daily engagement, just like training a muscle. But unlike willpower, which tends to fail under high stress conditions if it is not deeply conditioned, a trained prefrontal cortex becomes stronger the more it is challenged appropriately. Over time, the ability to delay gratification, to sit with discomfort, to make decisions based on long-term outcomes rather than short-term urges becomes the default rather than the exception. The brain becomes wired for resilience rather than reactivity. Humans are wired for social connection in ways that most people underestimate, especially when it comes to overcoming addictions. At the root level, our brains are designed to synchronize with the people around us. We have specialized neurons called mirror neurons that fire not just when we perform an action, but when we observe someone else performing that action. These neurons allow us to empathize, to learn through imitation, and crucially to internalize the behaviors, emotions, and even the motivations of the people we spend time around. When it comes to addiction, isolation is a massive risk factor, not simply because it leads to loneliness, but because it cuts off the corrective influence of positive social modeling. In isolation, the brain loops deeper into its own patterns without external checks or healthy interference. Recovery from addiction cannot happen in a vacuum. Even the most disciplined individual, if isolated, faces a much higher risk of relapse than someone who is embedded in a supportive, structured social network. This is because the social environment provides more than just encouragement. It actively reshapes neural circuits through direct exposure to modeled behaviors. If you spend time with individuals who manage stress without substances, who delay gratification, who engage in healthy routines, your mirror neurons pick up those patterns, often without your conscious awareness. Over time, these observed behaviors start to influence your own neural wiring, making self-regulation easier and more automatic. The tool here is very simple. At its core, create deliberate social accountability structures. The simplest version is telling at least one other person about your specific goals, your plan, and your progress. But the more structured and repeated the exposure to supportive individuals, the stronger the rewiring effect becomes. Group settings amplify this effect significantly. When you participate in a recovery group, a support network, or even a small, consistent gathering of trusted friends where progress is discussed openly, the multiple layers of mirroring, accountability, and support create a kind of neural scaffolding that holds you up even when your internal motivation is low. It's important that the social environment you choose actively models the behaviors you want to internalize. Merely being around people who are neutral or non-judgmental is not enough. You want proximity to people who themselves are committed to resilience, discipline, and recovery. People who walk the path, not just talk about it. The brain is always tuning itself to its environment. If the environment models strength, adaptation becomes strength. If the environment models chaos, adaptation leans toward chaos. Structuring social accountability can also involve more dynamic forms of connection. For example, setting up regular check-ins with an accountability partner, daily or weekly, dramatically increases the likelihood of success. These check-ins do not need to be long or emotionally intense. They can be as straightforward as answering 3 questions. Did I follow my plan today? Where did I face the most difficulty? What is my plan for tomorrow? The act of verbalizing progress and setbacks keeps goals alive in conscious awareness and prevents the silent erosion of commitment that often happens when no one else knows what you're struggling with. Mirror neuron systems also respond to emotional tone, not just observable behavior. This is why emotional resonance matters in the people you surround yourself with. If your social circle carries an attitude of hope, determination, and belief in growth, your brain tunes into those emotional frequencies. Emotional contagion is real. It's why a group of determined individuals can lift a struggling member higher than that individual could have climbed alone. At the same time, exposure to cynicism, hopelessness, or resignation can drag down even the most well-intentioned recovery efforts. The modern world has made it simultaneously easier and harder to access the right social inputs. Easier because online communities exist for almost every conceivable recovery goal, offering immediate access to others walking the same path. Harder because algorithmic content delivery, especially on social media, often feeds addiction cycles themselves, reinforcing impulsivity, outrage, and instant gratification patterns. Being intentional about where and how you get your social input is critical. It's not enough to passively consume content. Active participation in supportive environments is what drives neural change. Even small shifts in social exposure patterns can create massive effects over time. Joining a weekly group, attending a daily online meeting, engaging in peer mentorship programs, these activities don't just provide psychological comfort. They actively reshape your brain's executive and reward systems, building resilience, increasing baseline dopamine sensitivity, and improving impulse control. Studies show that individuals who engage regularly with structured support communities show significantly lower relapse rates compared to those who try to recover in isolation. The mechanism isn't mysterious. It's mirror neurons adapting you to the models you immerse yourself in. Building social accountability also teaches an essential meta skill: vulnerability without collapse. Addiction often trains the brain to avoid vulnerability because vulnerability feels dangerous, associated with shame or judgment. But structured social connection teaches that vulnerability, when paired with action and growth, is not weakness, but power. Sharing struggle, setbacks, and small victories with others strengthens the neural circuits for emotional regulation and resilience. In very real terms, the people you consistently interact with become a part of your nervous system. Their behaviors, beliefs, emotions, and expectations shape the templates that your brain uses to navigate the world. In recovery, this principle can be harnessed with precision and intention. You can build a social brain that favors long-term resilience, that normalizes effort and persistence, that rewards delayed gratification over impulsive escape. One of the most underutilized tools for overcoming addiction is controlling visual and attentional focus. Most people underestimate just how tightly connected the visual system is to the brain's states of motivation, craving, and self-regulation. In neuroscience, we know that the eyes are literally part of the brain. They are not separate sensory organs, but direct extensions of the central nervous system, pushing out into the world to capture light and translate it into electrical signals that inform brain state. Where you place your visual focus at any given time strongly influences which neural circuits are activated, how alert or relaxed you feel, how motivated you become, and even how susceptible you are to cravings. There's a very specific mechanism behind this. When you engage in what's called foveal vision, when you narrow your gaze, focusing very precisely on a small target, you activate circuits associated with goal-directed behavior. This enhances focus, suppresses distractibility, and increases the release of neurochemicals like norepinephrine and acetylcholine that sharpen attention and readiness. In contrast, when you engage in panoramic vision, relaxing your gaze, taking in a wide field of view without focusing on any single point, you activate circuits that downshift stress responses, reduce sympathetic arousal, and promote a state of calm alertness. Understanding this distinction gives you enormous leverage over addictive impulses. Cravings often come with a narrow focus on the object of desire, whether it's a drink, a device, a behavior, or a substance. The brain locks in visually and cognitively on the target, reinforcing the loop. The more tightly you focus on the object of craving, the more urgent the craving becomes. One of the fastest ways to disrupt this feedback loop is to deliberately shift into panoramic vision. The act of relaxing your visual field, deliberately broadening your gaze, immediately sends a signal to the brain that the environment is safe, that action is not immediately necessary, that urgency can be reduced. This isn't a psychological trick. It's a real, measurable change in autonomic nervous system activity, influencing heart rate, blood pressure, and the release of stress hormones. Practically speaking, this can be trained and deployed both proactively and reactively. As a daily proactive practice, spending even 1 to 3 minutes per day deliberately engaging panoramic vision can lower baseline stress and improve overall impulse control. The protocol is simple. Find a neutral environment, ideally outside, and allow your gaze to soften. Rather than focusing on any single object, take in as much of the visual field as possible. The periphery, the horizon, the sky. Let your breathing remain natural. No need to force anything. The key is to maintain awareness of the broad visual field without collapsing attention onto any particular point. Over time, this trains the brain to be more flexible in switching between high focus states and low stress, broad awareness states. Reactively, when a craving arises, the immediate tendency is to lock visual and mental focus on the craving trigger. Training yourself to instead step back, engage panoramic vision, and stay in that mode for even 30 to 60 seconds can significantly reduce the intensity of the craving. The brain shifts out of a reactive state and into a reflective one. With practice, this shift becomes almost automatic. The craving appears, but instead of locking in and reinforcing it, the nervous system de-escalates, giving you the critical few seconds needed to choose a different action. Another layer to using visual focus as a tool involves intentional goal visualization during periods of craving or vulnerability. The same circuits that get hijacked by addiction, the mesolimbic dopamine pathways, are also activated when we vividly imagine future rewards. Deliberately spending time imagining in rich sensory detail the long-term benefits of sobriety, resilience, and health activates dopamine release without the crash that comes from addictive behaviors. When practiced regularly, this kind of visualization strengthens the brain's ability to prioritize long-term outcomes over short-term relief. It's important to note that visualization is most effective when it's paired with a sense of agency. Simply fantasizing about a better future without linking it to actionable steps tends to have little or no positive effect and can even backfire. But when you visualize the process, the small daily wins, the acts of discipline, the successful navigation of cravings. You create a feedback loop in the brain that makes those behaviors more likely to occur. You are literally rehearsing success at the neural level. Another nuance to using vision for addiction recovery is environmental control. And visual cues in the environment, seeing a bottle, a phone, a gambling advertisement, can trigger cravings even when motivation is high. Structuring your environment so that high-risk visual stimuli are minimized and replacing them with cues that trigger positive habits can have a profound effect. Simple actions like keeping recovery reminders visible, designing living spaces to minimize passive triggers, and consciously choosing environments that promote calm and focus all leverage the visual system's powerful influence over behavior. The brain evolved to prioritize whatever is in the visual field. If a substance, device, or behavior is constantly visible, even in peripheral awareness, the craving circuits are being primed continually, often below the level of conscious thought. Conversely, if the visual field is filled with cues associated with health, connection, growth, and long-term goals, the brain's motivational systems adapt accordingly. The key principle is that vision and attention are entry points into deeper brain systems governing craving, motivation, and decision-making. By training where and how you place your visual and attentional focus, you're not just managing cravings in the moment, you're fundamentally rewiring the machinery that governs long-term behavior and self-regulation. Sleep is the foundation upon which all forms of behavior change are built, and addiction recovery is no exception. When sleep is disrupted, the brain's ability to regulate emotions, resist impulses, and consolidate learning is dramatically impaired. Conversely, when sleep is optimized, the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for executive function and self-control, operates more efficiently, emotional reactivity decreases, and the capacity to make decisions aligned with long-term goals increases. Understanding sleep not just as a passive state, but as an active tool for rewiring the brain is essential in overcoming both substance and behavioral addictions. During sleep, particularly during slow-wave deep sleep, the brain engages in a process called synaptic homeostasis. This is when the neural circuits that have been heavily used during waking hours are selectively strengthened or weakened. If you are actively engaging in behaviors to resist addictive impulses during the day, it is during sleep that those new patterns get consolidated into long-term neural architecture. Without sufficient quality sleep, the brain cannot effectively prune away the old compulsive patterns or reinforce the new, healthier ones. Every night of disrupted or insufficient sleep represents a missed opportunity for neural remodeling critical to lasting recovery. One of the major challenges is that addiction itself often disrupts natural sleep patterns. Many substances directly interfere with the production of neurotransmitters necessary for normal sleep cycles, such as GABA, serotonin, and melatonin. Behavioral addictions, such as compulsive internet use or gambling, often hijack circadian rhythms by exposing the brain to excessive artificial light, hyperstimulation, and irregular sleep-wake schedules. Therefore, addressing sleep is not just about getting more rest, but about restoring the fundamental biological rhythms that govern the brain's ability to heal. One of the most effective and accessible ways to anchor the sleep system is to control light exposure. The primary input to the circadian clock is light, particularly sunlight, in the early part of the day. Getting natural light exposure within the first 30 to 60 minutes after waking up sets the timing of melatonin release about 14 to 16 hours later, ensuring that you will feel sleepy at the appropriate time that night. Without morning light, the circadian system drifts, melatonin release becomes erratic, and sleep onset becomes inconsistent. This creates a vicious cycle where irregular sleep further impairs impulse control, making relapse more likely. Even on cloudy days, the intensity of outdoor light is orders of magnitude greater than indoor lighting. The protocol is simple but powerful. Go outside, face the general direction of the sun, and allow natural light to enter your eyes without sunglasses for about 5 to 10 minutes in the morning. No need to stare directly at the sun. Indirect exposure is sufficient and safer. The key is to allow your internal clock to receive the strong time of day signal it needs to properly regulate sleep and wakefulness. Equally important is minimizing artificial light exposure, particularly blue light in the 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. Blue wavelengths suppress melatonin production, making it much harder to fall asleep and stay asleep. Practical strategies include dimming indoor lights, wearing blue light blocking glasses in the evening, and reducing screen exposure. If screens must be used, software that shifts screen coloration toward warmer tones can partially mitigate the impact. In addition to light management, establishing consistent sleep and wake times plays a critical role. The brain's circadian clock is most stable when sleep occurs at the same general time every night, even on weekends. Variability of even 1 to 2 hours can create a kind of internal jet lag, impairing both sleep quality and cognitive control the next day. For individuals in recovery, protecting sleep regularity is as important as protecting sobriety itself, because the two are deeply intertwined at the biological level. Another powerful but often overlooked factor is body temperature regulation. Core body temperature naturally drops before sleep onset. Supporting this natural cooling can enhance sleep initiation. Simple behaviors like taking a warm shower or bath 1 to 2 hours before bed can paradoxically help cool the body by causing blood to move toward the surface and radiate heat away. Sleeping in a cool, dark environment further supports deep sleep stages, critical for emotional regulation and memory consolidation. Nutrition and exercise timing also play a role. Consuming large meals too close to bedtime can disrupt sleep by raising body temperature and activating digestive processes that keep the brain more alert. Ideally, finish eating 2 to 3 hours before sleep. Similarly, while exercise is generally beneficial for sleep, intense physical activity late at night can elevate adrenaline and body temperature, delaying sleep onset. Morning or early afternoon exercise tends to have the most positive effect on nighttime sleep quality. Lastly, practices that activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest branch, can facilitate the transition into sleep. Controlled breathing exercises, such as cyclic sighing, where you take a deep inhale, followed by a second, smaller inhale, and then a long, slow exhale, can downshift the nervous system rapidly. Practicing such techniques in the 5 to 10 minutes before bedtime can decrease sleep latency and improve overall sleep architecture, including the amount of deep and REM sleep obtained. Optimizing sleep is not an optional luxury when it comes to addiction recovery. It is a direct, non-negotiable biological foundation for everything else you are trying to achieve. Without it, willpower becomes depleted faster, emotional volatility increases, and the brain remains locked into old compulsive patterns. Overcoming addiction is not about willpower alone. It's about understanding the biology, deploying strategies that recalibrate the system, and designing an environment that favors your long-term goals. Change is absolutely possible. Not only that, it's predictable when the right tools are used consistently. Every effort you make literally rewires your brain. Every deliberate action strengthens the circuits of control and resilience. Addiction may feel like a life sentence, but it's actually a brain state, and brain states can change. Thank you.